The Galactic Academy of Survival Studies stood as a testament to the universe's most prestigious educational institutions, its crystalline spires reaching toward the triple suns of Centauri Prime. Within its hallowed halls, countless species learned the art of staying alive in the most inhospitable conditions the galaxy had to offer. And at the heart of this academic excellence stood Professor HFY, a being whose reputation preceded them like a solar wind. The professor, with their 7 symmetrical appendages and iridescent scales that shifted colors with their mood, currently displayed a deep shade of purple, the universal sign of academic superiority. They had earned this attitude through centuries of teaching and a perfect record of predicting survival outcomes across 2,000 different species. "Welcome, class, to Advanced Xenoplanetary Survival Theory," HFY announced, their vocal sacs vibrating with barely contained enthusiasm. "This term, we'll explore the absolute limits of biological adaptation and—" They paused, their scales flickering briefly to orange as their compound eyes focused on the classroom door. A human walked in. The entire class, consisting of 23 different species, turned their various sensory organs toward the newcomer. The human, dressed in the standard academy uniform that somehow looked both too tight and too loose on their bizarrely asymmetrical frame, took the only available seat, right in the front row. "Ah," HFY's scale shifted to a condescending shade of mauve. "Our first human student. How quaint. Name?" "Reeves," the human replied, pulling out a ridiculously primitive carbon-based note-taking device. Some students whispered about the archaic technology, their tentacles and appendages waving in amusement. "Well, Student Reeves, you should know that this class has a 98% failure rate among non-metamorphic species, given humanities." HFY's voice dripped with scientific disdain. "Limited adaptive capabilities, perhaps the basic survival course would be more appropriate." Reeves looked up, meeting all 7 of the professor's eyes simultaneously, a feat that made several classmates gasp. "With all due respect, Professor, I've reviewed the course requirements. I'm qualified to be here." The professor's scales rippled with barely contained amusement. "Qualified? By whose standards? Your species has barely mastered interstellar travel. You still require liquid water and oxygen to survive. You can't even photosynthesize." "We manage," Reeves replied, scratching notes with a manual writing implement that made several plasma-based lifeforms cringe. HFY's scales settled into a deep indigo, the color of academic challenge accepted. "Very well. Let's see how you manage when faced with real survival scenarios. I assume you've all completed the preliminary reading on Class X Death Worlds." The human nodded along with the rest of the class, though HFY noticed with satisfaction that Reeves's heart rate had increased slightly, according to their biosensors. Good. At least the human had enough sense to be nervous. Little did HFY know that what they interpreted as anxiety was actually Reeves suppressing laughter. After all, the human had grown up in Australia. Professor HFY's holographic display illuminated the classroom with a menacing red glow as it projected the image of a planet that looked like it had been baked in a cosmic oven and forgotten for a few million years. "This class is Kepler X 457, they announced, their scales now glowing with the same ominous red as the projection. "What you're looking at is the galaxy's perfect example of an impossible survival scenario. Surface temperatures range from 65 degrees Celsius during the night to 175 degrees Celsius during the triple sun peak. Atmospheric pressure is 1.5 times standard, with periodic silicon-based sandstorms that could strip the exoskeleton off a Chronaxian war beast." A collective shudder ran through the classroom. The Chronaxian student in the back row instinctively reinforced their armor plating. "The atmospheric composition is primarily nitrogen and carbon dioxide, with trace amounts of hydrogen sulfide. There is no surface water." The professor's voice carried the smug satisfaction of someone who had just announced that gravity was, in fact, still working. "In the past century, 15 different species have attempted survival challenges on this planet. None lasted more than 6 standard hours." Reeves raised a hand, which the professor pointedly ignored. "The record holder was a vulcanite metamorph who managed to survive by partially crystallizing their outer layer. Unfortunately, They failed to account for the silicon storms and were essentially turned into decorative wind chimes. Zixavaka projected images of the failed attempts, each more gruesome than the last. The human's hand remained stubbornly in the air. The planet's crust is primarily composed of heat-resistant minerals, making underground shelter impossible without specialized equipment. The few life forms that exist are microscopic extremophiles that produce highly toxic secretions. Any questions that aren't from the primate section? A quantum shifter raised 3 of their probability fields. Professor, wouldn't it be possible to survive by shifting between dimensional states? Excellent question. However, the planet's magnetic field creates quantum instabilities that make shifting unreliable. 2 shifters tried that approach last decade. We're still receiving echoes of their screams from parallel dimensions. Reeves cleared their throat loudly. The simple fact is, Zixavaka continued, their scales now showing patterns of academic triumph. Kepler X 457 represents the perfect example of an insurmountable survival challenge. It's why we use it as our primary case study for understanding the limits of biological adaptation. I'll do it, Reeves said, finally lowering their hand. The classroom fell so silent you could hear a whisperling's thoughts drop. The professor's scales cycled through several colors before settling on a shade of disbelieving chartreuse. You? Zixavaka's vocal sacs quivered with barely contained laughter. The oxygen-dependent, water-requiring, heat-sensitive human wants to attempt survival on Kepler X 457. 3 days, Reeves proposed, scratching something in their primitive notebook. Standard survival challenge rules, minimal equipment loadout. Are you volunteering for suicide? A concerned empath from the 3rd row projected waves of worry. Your species can barely handle moderate temperature variations. Reeves shrugged. Sometimes the best way to handle impossible odds is to ignore them completely. Professor Zixavaka's scales finally settled on decision-making purple. Very well. If student Reeves wishes to provide us with a practical demonstration of survival failure, who am I to deny such an educational opportunity? We'll schedule your attempt for next week. I'll even waive the standard liability waiver, as your next of kin wouldn't be able to collect across interstellar distances anyway. The human smiled, a gesture that several species found both fascinating and disturbing. Just one question, Professor. The standard equipment loadout, it includes 1 item of student choice under 5 kilos, correct? Yes, Zixavaka waved a dismissive appendage, though I doubt any single item will make a difference in your case. Perfect. Reeves went back to their notes, humming something that sounded suspiciously like Waltzing Matilda. The betting pool opened before the class even ended. The odds of survival were calculated at roughly the same probability as a black hole developing social anxiety. The Academy's equipment vault resembled a museum of survival gear from across the galaxy. Crystalline environment suits lined one wall, while quantum stabilizers hummed softly in their charging stations along another. In the center of it all stood Reeves, holding what appeared to be a rather ordinary wooden stick. That's it. The equipment officer, a gelatinous blob named Blorp, rippled with confusion. Your chosen survival item is a piece of processed plant matter? Yep. Reeves tested the stick's weight, approximately 1 meter in length and 3 centimeters in diameter. It's maple. Maple, Blorp repeated, the word causing several of their sensory bubbles to pop in distress. You're facing temperatures that could melt chromium, and you choose maple. The betting pool had exploded over the past week. The odds against Reeves's survival had grown so astronomical that several quantum mathematics students had to be called in to calculate them. Currently, you could buy a small moon with the potential payout for a successful survival bet. Professor Zixavaka supervised the pre-departure inspection, their scales displaying an impressive light show of academic superiority mixed with barely contained glee. Standard survival kit contents, they announced, checking off items on a holographic list. 1 atmosphere converter basic model, 1 thermal regulator minimal capacity, 1 emergency beacon, and a stick. Don't forget the boots, Reeves added cheerfully. Standard issue thermal boots were part of the approved equipment list. Ah yes, the boots, the professor's scales flickered with amusement. Because footwear will make such a difference when you're being crystallized by silicon storms. A small crowd had gathered in the equipment vault. Students from other departments had heard about the crazy human and came to witness the preparation phase. Among them A group of predictors huddled in a corner, their probability arrays smoking as they tried to calculate possible survival scenarios. "We've run 10 million simulations," one predictor announced, their temporal lobes throbbing. "In exactly 0 of them does the stick provide any survival advantage." "Did you account for human stupidity in your calculations?" asked a veteran academy instructor passing by. "It tends to break probability matrices." The predictors shared worried looks and began recalculating. Meanwhile, Reeves went through the standard pre-departure procedures with an enthusiasm that made several empathic species nauseous. They signed waivers, using the stick as a penrest, underwent medical scans, holding the stick like a lucky charm, and attended the mandatory safety briefing during which they practiced balancing the stick on one finger. "Last chance to withdraw," Professor Zixivaka offered, their scales now showing genuine concern mixed with their usual superiority. "Your species' diplomatic standing won't be affected if you admit the challenge exceeds your capabilities." "No, I'm good," Reeves replied, now using the stick to scratch their back. "But I do have one request. Can we get the whole thing recorded? You know, for science." The professor's scales turned a particularly vivid shade of exasperation. "The Academy always records survival challenges, though in your case it will likely serve more as a cautionary tale than educational material." As the final preparations concluded, various species offered their last-minute advice. "Try quantum tunneling through the storm," suggested a phase shifter. "Evolve some heat resistance," called out a rapid adapter. "Right, I will," shouted someone from the back. Reeves took it all in stride, occasionally twirling the stick like a baton. They had packed the minimal survival kit into a standard-issue thermal bag, strapped on the boots, and seemed almost disappointingly normal for someone about to attempt the impossible. The Academy's medical team stood by, already preparing their "I told you so" reports. The emergency rescue squad ran equipment checks, expecting to be deployed within the first hour. Even the cafeteria staff had prepared a special last meal menu item called Human Hubris with a Side of Regret. "Transport leaves in 10 minutes, announced the launch controller, their tentacles waving official departure flags. Reeves nodded, then turned to the professor. "Want to hold my stick while I use the bathroom? Promise it won't bite." Professor Zixivaka's scales turned a color previously unknown to chromatic science. Just get in the transport pod." As Reeves walked toward the launch bay, stick in hand and whistling tunelessly, the gathered crowd watched with a mixture of awe, pity, and morbid curiosity. The betting odds ticked up one final time, reaching a point where a successful survival bet could now purchase a small galaxy cluster. Little did they know that back on Earth, this particular stick had once helped its owner survive 3 days in the outback, 2 days in the Sahara, and one very eventful afternoon in Death Valley. The transport pod's landing thrusters kicked up a storm of crystalline sand as it touched down on Kepler X 457's surface. Through the pod's thermal-shielded windows, the landscape resembled what might happen if someone had put a planet-sized desert into a kiln and left it on high for a few million years. The mission control's voice crackled through the pod's communication system. "External temperature currently reading at 168 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric pressure at 1.5 standard. Wind speed at 45 kilometers per hour. Opening pod doors in 3, 2, 1. A blast of superheated air rushed into the pod as Reeves stepped onto the planet's surface. The thermal regulator in their survival suit immediately began screaming warnings in 17 different languages, including 2 that had been extinct for centuries. "Status check, Student Reeves." Professor Zixivaka's voice carried artificial calm. "How are you feeling about your life choices?" "Bit warm," Reeves replied, squinting through the heat haze. The landscape stretched out in endless waves of red-orange dunes, punctuated by jagged outcroppings of heat-fractured rock. 3 suns blazed overhead like angry eyes, their combined glare turning the sky into a furnace. "Reminds me of a Tuesday back home." The professor's exasperated sigh caused static in the communication line. "Your thermal regulator has approximately 4 hours of charge at current temperatures. What's your survival strategy?" Reeves studied the stick in their hand, then the surrounding terrain. With deliberate movements that made the watching xenobiologists wince, they began walking toward the nearest rock formation, using the stick to test the sand before each step. The human is probing the ground, an observer in mission control questioned. Probably looking for underground creatures to make friends with, another replied sarcastically. They do that in their entertainment videos. But Reeves had a different plan. Upon reaching the rock formation, they began tapping various surfaces with the stick, listening intently. The sound echoed through the mission control's audio feed, driving several sensitive-eared species to seek noise cancellation. Aha! Reeves exclaimed after the 15th tap. They had found a section of rock with a slightly different resonance, using the stick as a lever, causing several engineering students to calculate the impossibility of the physics involved. They managed to pry loose a section of the heat-stressed stone. Behind it lay a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. "You're not seriously considering," Professor Zixavaka began, but Reeves was already shimmying into the gap stick first. The crevice angled downward at roughly 30 degrees, creating a natural chimney effect. More importantly, the temperature reading on their suit display began to drop. "Fascinating," muttered a geology expert in mission control. "They've found a naturally occurring thermal refuge, but the atmospheric pressure at that depth—" "Currently mapping the cave system," Reeves's voice came through, slightly distorted. "Stick's working great as a depth sounder. Also found some of those toxic extremophiles you mentioned. They're clustering on the ceiling in regular patterns, might be following underground water movements." The mission control room fell silent, broken only by the sound of several probability calculators exploding as they tried to process the changing survival odds. Using the stick as a combination of walking staff, probe, and measuring tool, Reeves navigated deeper into the rock formation. They found a chamber where the temperature dropped to a merely sweltering 85 degrees Celsius, protected from the worst of the surface heat by layers of mineral deposits. "Setting up base camp," they announced, causing several betting officials to choke on their beverages. "The rock's got some interesting properties, when you tap it just right." They demonstrated by striking a particular spot with the stick, producing a resonating ring. Sound carries through the whole formation. Built-in early warning system for those storms you mentioned. Professor Zixavaka's scales had reportedly turned a shade of confused purple, never before documented in xenobiology texts. But the atmospheric pressure should be crushing you." "Oh, that," Reeves replied casually while using the stick to scratch marks on the cave wall. "Found some natural vents in the rock. Created a nice pressure gradient. Basic fluid dynamics, really. We learned about it in grade school when building tree houses." Over the next hour, Reeves transformed their section of the cave into something that could charitably be called a shelter. They used the stick to test structural integrity, mark safe paths, and even create a primitive sundial using shadows cast by the triple suns through the cave's entrance. Current external temperature climbing to 173 degrees Celsius, Mission Control reported. First silicon storm expected in approximately 7 hours. "Plenty of time," Reeves responded cheerfully. They had positioned themselves near a cluster of extremophiles, using the stick to direct small air currents toward them. "These little guys are actually pretty helpful. They seem to metabolize silicon particles, might come in handy during the storm." A xenobiologist watching the feed fainted, overwhelmed by the casual violation of at least 7 fundamental survival principles. "Also," Reeves added, now using the stick to sketch something in the sand, "I'm pretty sure I've found signs of ancient water flow patterns. The cave floor has some interesting erosion marks. Give me another hour and I might have a working theory about seasonal underground springs." In Mission Control, the betting odds underwent their first significant shift. The payout for survival had dropped to merely the value of a small solar system. Professor Zixavaka's voice, when it came through again, sounded strained. "Student Reeves, are you suggesting that you've secured shelter, mapped subterranean features, and identified potential water sources with a stick?" "Well, yeah," Reeves replied, now using said stick to conduct what appeared to be a mineral hardness test. "It's a really good stick." Hour 12 into the survival challenge, and the mission control room had devolved into what could only be described as organized chaos. 3 different xenobiologists were arguing over the impossibility of what they were witnessing, while a team of engineers had started a support group for victims of human physics violations. Reeves had turned their stick into what they called a multi-tool, though Professor Zixavaka insisted on calling it an offense to rational technology. The principle is pretty simple, Reeves explained while jamming their stick into a narrow crevice. These rock formations expand and contract with the temperature changes. During peak heat, moisture trapped inside turns to vapor. When it cools down, they pulled the stick out, now dripping with condensation, free water. That's not how thermodynamics works, protested a physicist in mission control. Tell that to the water, Reeves replied, carefully collecting the drops in their thermal bag, which they'd modified into a makeshift reservoir. The stick's grain pattern is perfect for capturing condensation, plus these little grooves I carved help channel the water. The professor's scales had been stuck on a confused mauve for the past hour, but the atmospheric composition. Oh right, the toxic gases, Reeves gestured to a crude filtration system they'd created using layers of silicon-eating extremophiles. Turns out these little fellows don't just eat silicon, they also process hydrogen sulfide, set up a basic biological filter using gravity feed. The stick helps direct airflow through the colonies. A xenomicrobiologist had to be sedated after witnessing this casual manipulation of extremophile behavior patterns. Reeves had also developed what they called a navigation grid by planting their stick at different points around their shelter and measuring shadow patterns from the triple suns. Each sun casts a different colored shadow because of atmospheric refraction, they explained. By tracking the intersection points, I can calculate time of day and storm movements. That's not... The professor seemed to be running out of ways to express scientific outrage. Also found these, Reeves pointed to what looked like crystal formations deep in the cave. They're some sort of mineral growth. Watch this. They tapped the crystals with their stick, producing a series of musical tones, different pitches based on temperature, built-in thermal warning system. The cave itself had been transformed. Using the stick as a lever, measuring tool, and excavation device, Reeves had created a network of channels that directed airflow to maintain a relatively stable temperature. They'd even established what they called a garden, though it consisted entirely of carefully cultivated extremophile colonies. They're not just for air filtration, Reeves explained, proudly showing off their microbial farm. These organisms process minerals in a way that creates edible byproducts. Well, edible if you're not too picky about taste, kind of like my college cafeteria food. A nutrition specialist in mission control began crying quietly. The temperature regulation system was perhaps the most bizarre application of stick-based technology. Reeves had discovered that by positioning their stick at specific angles and creating air channels, they could establish convection currents that helped moderate the cave's temperature. It's all about working with the environment, not against it, they explained, while adjusting their stick's position by approximately 2 degrees. These rocks aren't just hot, they're heat batteries. Channel it right, and you can make it work for you. The betting odds had shifted so dramatically that several quantum computers had refused to calculate them, citing philosophical objections to the manipulation of probability. Student Reeves, Professor Zixavaka's voice carried a mixture of exasperation and unwilling fascination. Are you suggesting that you've created a self-sustaining survival system using nothing but a stick and a fundamental misunderstanding of established scientific principles? Not really, Reeves replied, using their stick to sketch what looked suspiciously like a blueprint for improvements in the sand. I understand the principles just fine. I'm just choosing to be creative with their application. A team of advanced survival theory students had started taking notes, much to their professor's horror. Besides, Reeves continued, now using the stick to conduct what appeared to be an acoustic survey of deeper cave sections, I haven't even started on the really interesting stuff. Did you know these cave formations have natural resonance chambers? With the right stick placement, you can predict silicon storms about 2 hours before they hit. The crystals start singing. In mission control, a geology expert began banging their head against a wall, leaving slightly radioactive dents in the metal. Oh, and I think I've figured out how to use the extremophiles to process the silicon from the storms into building material. Just need to adjust the stick angle to optimize their feeding patterns. Might build an extension to the shelter, maybe add a nice patio. Professor Zixavaka's scales had achieved a color that suggested either transcendent awareness or an imminent nervous breakdown. A patio, they repeated weakly, on a death world. Well, yeah, Reeves replied, already starting to map out the addition with their stick. The view of the triple sunset is quite nice once you get used to the whole everything is trying to kill you vibe. Reminds me of home. Hour 36 into the survival challenge, and Kepler X 457 decided to remind everyone why it had earned its Death World status. The silicon storm rolled in like a wall of crystalline razors, turning the sky into a glittering apocalypse. Storm approaching at 147 kilometers per hour, Mission Control announced, their voice tight with concern. Student Reeves, we recommend immediate activation of your emergency beacon. Nah, we're good, Reeves replied, standing at the cave entrance with their stick held out like a conductor's baton. Listen to the crystals sing. The cave's crystal formations had indeed begun emitting an eerie harmony as the storm approached. Reeves had positioned their stick at precise points around the entrance, creating what they called a disruption matrix, but what Professor Zixavaka termed blind luck given physical form. The stick positions create vortexes in the airflow, Reeves explained as the storm hit. The silicon particles, instead of shredding everything in their path, began spinning in complex patterns around the cave entrance. By using the natural resonance of the crystals and the stick's placement, we can actually direct the storm's energy. In Mission Control, 3 different physics professors submitted their resignations. The storm raged for 6 hours. During this time, Reeves not only survived, but managed to implement what they called Phase 2 of their survival strategy. They had positioned their modified thermal bag at specific points in the disruption matrix, collecting silicon particles that the extremophiles promptly began processing. Student Reeves, Professor Zixavaka's voice carried the weight of someone watching their entire academic career being rewritten by a primate with a stick. Are you farming the storm? Well, the silicon makes great building material once the little guys process it, Reeves replied, using their stick to pat a nearby extremophile colony affectionately. Plus, they seem happier with the fresh silicon. Listen, they're humming. A xenobiologist who had just recovered from their earlier fainting spell promptly passed out again. By hour 40, Reeves had officially broken the survival record for Kepler X 457. They celebrated by using their stick to carve what they claimed was a traditional Earth victory dance pattern in the processed silicon coating the cave floor. The sustainable systems are really coming together now, they explained while working. The storm actually helped charge up the heat batteries in the rocks, which means better temperature regulation. The processed silicon is strengthening the cave walls, and the extremophiles are reproducing at a rate that suggests they approve of their new environment. This defies every known principle of planetary adaptation, Professor Zixavaka protested. Not really, Reeves replied, now using their stick to conduct what appeared to be a harmonic resonance test with the crystal formations. It's just about working with what you've got. The planet's trying to kill you. Use its weapons as tools. Hostile environment, make it your home. Deadly storm, free building materials. The betting odds had become so complex that they had achieved sentience and were requesting legal representation. By hour 45, Reeves had established what they termed a comfortable routine. The cave system, now reinforced with processed silicon and humming with happy extremophiles, maintained a stable temperature of 82 degrees Celsius. Water collection had become automated through their stick-based condensation system, and the crystal formations had been tuned to provide advance warning of any approaching storms. I think I might write a paper about this, Reeves mused while using their stick to sketch equations in the silicon dust. Something about adaptive survival techniques in supposedly impossible environments, though I might leave out the bit about the stick wouldn't want to make it too easy for the next student. In Mission Control, Professor Zixavaka's scales had settled into a shade of resigned admiration mixed with academic horror. The human had not only survived, but had turned one of the galaxy's most notorious death worlds into something approaching a habitable environment, and they'd done it all with a stick. As the 72-hour mark approached, the rescue team arrived expecting to collect either a corpse or a gibbering wreck of a human. Instead, they found Reeves sitting cross-legged at the cave entrance, using their stick to conduct what appeared to be a symphony of crystalline harmonics. "Welcome to Chateau Impossible," Reeves greeted them cheerfully. "Mind the extremophiles on your way in, they're a bit protective of their new silicon gardens." The rescue team's leader, a highly trained crisis response specialist, stared at the scene before them. The once hostile cave had been transformed into a self-sustaining habitat. Processed silicon formations created elegant support structures, extremophile colonies pulsed in organized patterns, and a complex network of condensation channels provided a steady supply of filtered water. But, the team's xenobiologists stuttered, their sensory appendages twitching uncontrollably. "This is a death world." "Was a death world," Reeves corrected, using their stick to tap a nearby crystal formation, producing a pleasant chiming sound. "Now it's more of a fixer-upper with great potential. Excellent views, unique architectural features, friendly microscopic neighbors, just needs some curtains." Back at the Academy, Professor Zixavaca's lecture hall was packed beyond capacity. Species from across the galaxy had come to witness the debriefing of the human who had broken not just the survival record, but apparently several laws of physics in the process. Therefore, Reeves concluded their presentation, still holding their now famous stick, the key to survival isn't about having the most advanced technology or the most evolved adaptations. It's about understanding that everything, even things trying to kill you, can become tools for survival if you're creative enough. "But the stick," a quantum physics student called out. "How did you know it would work for so many different applications?" Reeves shrugged. "Honestly, I didn't. But here's the thing about humans. We've been using sticks to solve problems since we first climbed down from the trees. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, especially when you're too stubborn to die." Professor Zixavaca, their scales now displaying a complex pattern that xenochromatics experts would study for years to come, finally spoke. "Student Reeves, you have redefined what we consider possible in survival situations. Your methods were unorthodox, arguably insane, and thoroughly human." They paused, their vocal sacs quivering. It was brilliant. The Academy's curriculum underwent significant revisions following the event. A new course was added: Creative Problem Solving, the Human Approach to Impossible Situations. The stick was enshrined in a display case, though Reeves insisted on replacing it with a replica, claiming they might need the original for future adventures. The impact on interspecies relations was profound. Humans, previously regarded as primitive beings, barely worth notice, suddenly found themselves being consulted on survival strategies across the galaxy. Their reputation for turning death worlds into holiday homes with nothing but primitive tools and stubborn determination became legendary. "The universe," Reeves explained in their final address to the Academy, "isn't divided into possible and impossible situations. It's divided into problems we've solved and problems we haven't figured out how to hit with a stick yet." The betting pools, having achieved consciousness, decided to retire and open a probability consulting firm. As for Kepler X 457, it was reclassified from certain death to challenging with potential. The extremophile colonies Reeves had cultivated continued to thrive, creating the foundation for a possible future research station. The crystal formations still sang their warning songs before storms, now accompanied by the tapping of sticks, as other survival students learned to conduct the planet's deadly symphony. Professor Zixavaca's final note in their academic journal read, "Perhaps the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't a death world or an impossible situation. It's a human armed with a stick and the audacity to ignore what everyone else knows to be impossible." They added a postscript: "Note to self, begin research into humanity's relationship with other simple tools. The galaxy may not survive their discovery of the spoon."